This video is learning targets 2 through 4 in the ecology unit. We're going to be looking at different kinds of ecosystems. First types of ecosystems we're going to look at are aquatic ecosystems. We're going to start by looking at marine ecosystems, or oceans. These are saltwater ecosystems. A couple of zones that are important to consider when looking at marine ecosystems. One of them is the intertidal zone. This is the zone that is underwater at high tide and exposed at low tide. Certain types of organisms live here, like crabs, birds fly around this area. Some types of plants live in this area, but organisms that are able to sustain this constant change and be able to live in this constant change are adapted well for this organism. The photic zone, and you can see that there, the photic zone, photic means light, and so this is all of the area that has light. I think this picture may be a little misleading because it looks so small, but the photic zone goes down 1,000 meters. This is pretty long. So light is able to get in down 1,000 meters. These are where producers are going to live, things that you can use the light for photosynthesis to make food. So lots of biodiversity in this area, lots of plants and animals at every level. And then the aphotic zone, this is the zone that is perpetually dark because their light is unable to get down there. Producers can't use photosynthesis, so they have to do something else if they're going to be a producer in this area. And biodiversity typically is lower in the aphotic zone. Then there's the benthic zone. You can see that there, the arrows. That's the ocean floor. It's basically the entire bottom, whether it's up near the shore or down there by those little volcanoes, whatever those are. That's just the ocean floor. Sometimes there's lava coming out of the ocean floor, but that's really deep. But that's the benthic zone, whether you're near the coast or really far down, 9,000 meters down. And then there's the pelagic zone. The pelagic zone is basically anything that's not near the coast. It's kind of the open ocean that's not the floor also. So the pelagic zone is definitely by far the largest part of the ocean. This is just kind of a catch-all term for every part of the ocean that's not up near the coast and not the ocean floor. Now, looking at freshwater systems, we're going to see some similar terms. This is like lakes and streams and rivers and that sort of thing. Similar terms. We're going to have the photic and aphotic zones. Depending on the type of lake, the photic zone may be really small if it's a dark and murky lake. But in the freshwater ecosystems, you're going to have the littoral zone. And the littoral zone is the area near the shore where the plants grow. And the limnetic zone, which is kind of like the open lake, similar to like the pelagic zone in the ocean. But other than that, freshwater lakes tend to have similar ideas as oceans, except for littoral and limnetic zones. Next is the wetlands, and wetlands are essentially any area of land that is covered with water at least part of the time. And so a wetland can be dry part of the time and wet part of the time, or it can just be wet all the time. There are two types of wetlands that we're going to look at. First type of wetland is swamps, and swamps are pretty, we can recognize a swamp, but the thing that makes a swamp are trees. Swamps are wetlands that have trees in them, and certain types of organisms can live in swamps that can live in and out of water just fine, like reptiles, mammals, that sort of thing. And then the other type of wetland is a marsh, and these are wetlands with no trees. And yes, you see trees in the background, I get that. But this would be like in colder regions that don't support a lot of trees or a lot of types of trees that you would find in a swamp in this part of the country. So you see lots of evergreens. And so marshy regions tend to be more northern, but we do have marshes in this part of the country as well. Another aquatic ecosystem is called an estuary, and this is the region where freshwater and ocean meet. It is filled with a type of water called brackish water, which is partly salty, a mix of marine and freshwater fish and life tend to be here. So this is lots and lots of biodiversity. And that has a lot to do with the nutrient content of the water, very high. The water in some places in estuaries is almost black. The nutrient content is so high, we think of black water and think nasty, but apparently fish think hooray for all the nutrients. Now, some abiotic factors when we're looking at aquatic ecosystems. Of course, water is abiotic, and water's in all aquatic ecosystems. But there's a lot of things going on in the water that are important. For instance, temperature. Water temperature has a lot to do with an ecosystem, of an aquatic ecosystem. And of course, most importantly, uh, oxygen levels. Don't forget that fish and other things that don't breathe air like you and I do, it doesn't mean they don't need oxygen. And so if there's no oxygen in the water, there's no life in the water. And so oxygen content very important. Currents in the water, whether it's a really fast current or really slow current or no current. Nutrient content in the water, very important. So all these are important abiotic factors when thinking about aquatic ecosystems. Now next, we're going to look at terrestrial ecosystems, and a terrestrial ecosystem is an ecosystem that is on land. Terrestrial, big word for land. And terrestrial ecosystems, typically when we think of them, we think of biomes, these large areas with similar climate communities, and typically determined by the latitude or elevation. Could be, it's cold in the poles, but it's also cold 25,000 feet up. And you can be 25,000 feet up in the middle of South America. And so elevation does have a lot to do with the type of ecosystem that you're in. Some abiotic factors concerning terrestrial ecosystems. The main three that I want to look at are climate, weather, and nutrients. And all these things can be kind of encompassed into different biomes depending on the climate and depending on the weather. Climate is basically the average temperature and precipitation in an area over time. And so a lot of times we get climate and weather mixed up, and recognizing that we've had these words since we were, 8 years old or whatever. But I think, it's easy for someone to walk outside and say, hey, it's not getting warmer, or it's not cold or anything like that, because look at what today is. Well, we can't really put together in our minds what the average of an area looks like without writing these things down and tabulating them and figuring them out over the course of years and years. And so when it comes to a concept like climate change, understanding climate change has to do with looking at averages, not the day to day. Well, it snowed 15 inches this year. Okay, but if we look at the averages over the last 50 years, we see changes, we see trends, and so that is what climate change is all about. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about human involvement in ecosystems. And again, that's different than weather. Weather is what you look outside, you just walk outside, and that is the conditions right then. That is the weather. The weather changes all the time. The weather can be sunny one minute and cloudy the next, or stormy the next. And so this is a very important distinction to make between climate and weather. Weather is always changing. Climate tends to be the same, tends to always kind of exist in this norm. And another very important part of an ecosystem is nutrients. Nutrients are just the chemicals that organisms need to live. These are things like carbs and lipids and water and all of these things that we've talked about. And nutrients tend to exist in cycles in ecosystems. And so we talk about these kinds of cycles. You've been learning about this since you watched The Lion King and the Circle of Life. Well, some of these nutrient cycles we've been talking about again since we were 8, like the water cycle. Not very difficult to understand that precipitation brings water to the earth, and evaporation and water from plants takes it back to the atmosphere, and this is a constant happening thing. Much there's a lot that can be said about the water cycle, but we're going to kind of just skip over it. And then the carbon cycle, a little more complicated. Carbon is the second most abundant atom in living things. It's required for all organic molecules. It's required for all life. And so it also has to cycle through the ecosystem. Carbon is found in the atmosphere as CO2, and it enters a community through plants via photosynthesis, made into sugars. And so organisms then consume those carbon molecules, consume that carbon for energy. And then once we use it, we give it back off as CO2. And so there's a cycle there. Carbon enters the ground when organisms die, when organisms give off waste. Carbon enters back into the ground. Carbon enters the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are just fuels that were made from dinosaurs and plants being pressed together for millions of years and making oil and coal and that sort of thing. And they're just fuels that are made of carbon. And so when we burn them, put CO2 back into the atmosphere. Nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen cycle is a pretty complex egg to crack. We're going to keep it pretty simple here. Nitrogen is the most abundant gas in the atmosphere. And so nitrogen diffuses into the ground from the atmosphere when it rains, when it's just not raining. Nitrogen can get into the atmosphere, but largely when it rains, it kind of soaks into the ground. And then nitrogen in the ground is then fixed. If you remember carbon fixation, CO2 is changed into something usable. Well, nitrogen is fixed. Nitrogen is changed into something usable. We can't use nitrogen in the atmosphere. Plants can't even use it. So we need it to be fixed. And what fixes nitrogen? Bacteria. This allows it to be used by us. This allows it to be used by plants. Of course, we're not eating the dirt to get the nitrogen. And so plants take in that mineral from or that element from the ground, and then they take it up. They use it to make things like DNA, proteins. Very important. Two very important elements. DNA and proteins. Cells can't exist without them. Plants make more cells by eating lots of nitrogen. And so this is what we do when we fertilize our gardens. Fertilizer is just essentially nitrogen. Lots of it. Plants use it to make more, and so they get bigger. That's why fertilized plants look bigger than non-fertilized plants. And then animals then consume those plants. They get that nitrogen. When we eat a piece of celery, we get its nitrogen. We eat all of its cells and get its DNA and its proteins. Organisms then decompose, return that nitrogen back to the soil, and it can be refixed by bacteria. This is how decomposers work in the ecosystem. Again, without bacteria fixing nitrogen and breaking down organisms after death, the ecosystems quickly die. This has to be happening in an ecosystem for the ecosystem to live. Remember, you learned about this in the Lion King. It's the circle of life. Without the bacteria breaking everything down, ecosystems would quickly die. Some plants are kind of able to do this on their own. You can see these little nodules on this plant here. These are like little bacteria houses. These types of plants are called legumes or beans, and they can make their own. Well, they have these areas of nitrogen fixing bacteria right there on the plant. It keeps it nice and close. Another cycle that's very important is the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is required for the production of cell membranes, it's required for DNA, it's required for ATP. Remember, we've talked about phosphate groups a lot in this class, so phosphorus is a very important mineral. Phosphorus comes from rocks. All phosphorus originated from rocks, and it was broken down in the process called weathering or erosion. It comes from animal waste, it comes from decomposition. It's taken up into plants, and those plants make organic molecules. We eat the plants, get that phosphorus, and then put it back in the ecosystem when we go away.